Hey, aloha, and welcome to Stan Energy Man here on ThinkTech Hawaii. This time we're coming to you live and direct from Pu'uwawa on the Big Island, which is in North Kona, from the Blue Planet Research Facilities. So my many thanks to Hank Rogers and Paul Ponthieux for letting me borrow their broadband up here and do the show from their location. And my guest today is Paul Ponthieux. We call him the pastor of the Church of the First Element because we had that set up a long time ago, and he really is. He's the biggest disciple of hydrogen that there is, and he does all of his work from right here at the Blue Planet Research Facility in Kona. And the reason it's so important is because I learned a long time ago that seeing is believing. And when you come to see Paul's facilities here in Pu'uwawa, you're seeing hydrogen storage at work, you're seeing photovoltaic cells at work, you're seeing the latest and greatest in lithium battery technology, which is not the cobalt variety, but I'm gonna let Paul talk about his batteries that he worked with Sony on. And it's really seeing is believing, and people come here and see what Paul's done, and they walk away with a whole different attitude of how hydrogen can play into an energy grid, into a microgrid, into a large grid, or even in a single family structure. So Paul, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Hey, my pleasure. And I like that background. For the folks that don't know, that's the hill behind his lab, and that's the lab on his right shoulder on the left side of your screen. And that hill is called Pu'uwawa. And it's an old cinder cone, but it looks so beautiful. It's lush and green like that, and it's just one of the most beautiful places on earth. So, well, Paul, to get started, let's get some people up to speed on lithium technology, because so many people are enamored by Elon Musk and his Tesla and the batteries and that cobalt technology, but it's really not the safest and the best. And you had a lot of time to research this and do the research for Hank Rogers. And tell us a little bit about this technology that you're working with.
Sure, I'd be happy to. We've actually spent about the last 7 years working with lithium battery technologies, in particular lithium ferrous phosphate. So the difference for most people, when they hear the term lithium battery, they think about only one type of battery, a lithium battery. They're used to hearing and seeing them in things like cell phones, laptops. Most of the modern day power tools all use lithium batteries at this point. But there's a huge difference between the chemistries of different types of lithium batteries. So behind you in those black cabinets are banks of lithium ferrous phosphate, or commonly known as lithium iron phosphate, or LFP. And the counterpart to that would be the cobalt NMC batteries that Panasonic and Tesla uses. The difference between the two, other than sharing the term lithium, they're pretty much like night and day. The lithium cobalt chemistries have thermal management issues that have to be mitigated and controlled. Otherwise, they can go into what's called thermal runaway, and literally they will heat up until they burst into flames and catch on fire. So Tesla mitigates that by using a liquid water cooling system to keep the batteries at an optimum temperature so they don't go into runaway. The lithium ferrous phosphate, and for short it's called LFP, they don't have thermal management issues at all. So we don't have to worry about them heating. This also adds longer life to the batteries. They have about a 40% longer cycle life. And that's what's really important when you invest in a lithium storage system. It's how many kilowatt hours over the life of the battery can it store. That's what you're literally paying for. So 40% is quite a margin compared to cobalt chemistries. So it makes the economics work out a little better. Now, having said that, LFP is more expensive than the cobalt, but only because of the scale of manufacturing difference between the two. And what we're seeing right now is that more and more companies around the world are switching to LFP because of the safety factor. Not just the long life, but also the safety. There have been multiple large fires at wind farms with the storage systems that use cobalt. In Korea, in particular, they've had several in the last couple of years. So that kind of puts a damper on using batteries for storage technology to the public, but it also wipes out the investment of the PPA that's running the wind farm. So typically what will happen when a large battery of 10 megawatts or so goes down, then it becomes a litigation experience. So people start suing each other, who's going to pay for the damage and who's going to replace the batteries.
And it's interesting. I had a conversation with one of our partners at H&EI that does lithium technology. And I told him, well, isn't lithium a kind of a fairly rare metal, you know? He goes, well, not as rare as cobalt. So actually cobalt is harder to, has much less of a natural reserve on the planet. We're gonna run out of cobalt long before we run out of lithium. And that's also the technology you don't want. And ferrous, you know, iron is pretty much everywhere. Olivine is pretty much everywhere, and that's what your batteries use. If you could slide a little bit to the right, people can see that your 1 megawatt scale battery there. That's a 1 megawatt lithium ferrous phosphate battery that's hooked up to a water well system and a solar array that's going to be powering it. Why don't you talk a little bit about that system?
Yeah, so this is, and I just wanted to comment, what you were saying about the cobalt was correct. And in addition, most of it comes from the Congo region, and they actually use child labor quite a bit in the mines. So there's a lot of negative things about cobalt. The battery behind me in the 20-foot container, that is a 1 megawatt hour battery, and it was built as a prototype, but specifically for the project that it's attached to. And that project is the community water system. Here at Pu'uvava Ranch, we have one of the 2 wells that make up the community water system for Napupu Water. And it serves about 135 customers in the community here. So it's a very deep well. It's about 2,500 feet deep. So it takes a lot of energy to pump the water up. And what you can't see in this picture behind me is the solar field, which is behind it on adjacent state property. So we got a lease from the state for about 1.7 acres. And on that, we've got about 300 kilowatts of PV panels. So during the day, the PV will run the well and charge the battery. And at nighttime, it'll switch over to the battery to continue pumping water. So this is an important pilot project for the water company. The county water company system is watching this very carefully because they pretty much have the same issues as everyone else. And here on the Big Island, they put in a series of 5 wind turbines in Lalamilo Valley, specifically to offset some of the pumping costs for the water. They didn't put in storage, unfortunately, so they're having some issues with that. The wind doesn't always blow, just like the sun doesn't always shine. So you actually have to have battery storage or some type of energy storage if you're going to use intermittent technologies like solar and wind.
Hey, Paul, can you also comment a little bit on the difference in cost between a megawatt hour of hydrogen storage versus a megawatt hour of lithium iron phosphate or lithium cobalt technology?
Yeah.
And kind of describe what that means when you go to a full-on grid where you're using gigawatts and gigawatts of storage.
Right. So there seems to be 2 camps in the energy storage world, and it's a little ridiculous because you have the battery, just like the battery electric cars versus the hydrogen fuel cell cars. Batteries are fantastic. You can't beat the efficiency. They're 95, 97% efficient. But when you start talking about storage in the megawatt hours, once you get past 2 to 3 megawatt hours of storage, the cost of the batteries become insurmountable in a lot of cases. They're incredibly expensive. So we're talking in the neighborhood of about $600 per kilowatt hour for battery. So a megawatt hour battery would run about $600,000. Excuse me. In that same 20-foot container, we could put 4 megawatt hours of hydrogen storage in addition to the battery, And the hydrogen would cost about 1/4 of what the batteries cost. So when you start talking about 50 megawatts, 100 megawatts, or get into the gigawatts, you're simply not going to do it with batteries. It's just, not only is it expensive, but getting the batteries, getting the number of batteries you would need, it's going to be difficult with long lead times. Hydrogen in tube trailers in a 20-foot container can store several hundred megawatt hours of energy. So you can, it's kilowatt hours, sorry. So it's much more cost effective. And the military has this issue too. They need 14 days of autonomy. And to get 2 weeks of runtime off of battery storage would just be ridiculous. In addition, you'd be storing electrons for months without using them. So what's the solution? The best case scenario is to have both. You have your batteries for your 24-hour turnover of electrons, your power, your daily cycle, and you use hydrogen for your long-term storage. That's the most economical solution that we have right now.
And so that kind of dovetails with how you run the ranch here, because the ranch behind Paul is actually run off of the grid independently. And there's 85 kilowatts of power on your laboratory. And then you just added some photovoltaics to the shop area. And the backup is some battery storage and then also hydrogen. So could you give us kind of the details on that?
Sure, the batteries are our daily use of energy storage. And then the batteries actually are usually charged within a few hours in the morning. They're usually typically at 100% by 10 or 11 o'clock at the latest. But even during the day, when the loads are light, we have a lot of excess energy, and that would normally just get thrown away. Well, we don't like to waste anything, and conservation is actually the very first easy step that anyone can do. So we take the excess energy that's not going to particular loads at the moment, and we split water into hydrogen. So we store that hydrogen in large tanks as a backup energy, and that replaces the use of a diesel generator. So our batteries get us through the night, and a long winter night when the weather's been bad for a couple of days, the batteries can actually get low enough that we can't charge them. And then the hydrogen fuel cells kick in and support the load. So again, the best scenario is the marriage of the two technologies, hydrogen and lithium battery technology.
Great. And another advantage to the hydrogen over batteries, especially for large scale storage, is batteries will discharge no matter how good they are just sitting there. They tend to self-discharge over time. And hey, hydrogen, as long as those things are not leaking, those tanks will keep the same amount of energy forever and ever. And and it's not anything real sophisticated. Our friend Roy McAllister has some tanks that were certified in 1917 that he still uses to store hydrogen. And so if the tanks will last 100 years, I'd say that's a pretty cheap investment for the future.
It is.
Hey, we're coming up on a break here, Paul. Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about some of the things going on around the world that are getting our attention. And I'd like for you to also talk about a film coming up. Was it At War with the Dinosaurs?
Yeah.
That people need to check out on Netflix and however you get your movies nowadays. So we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with Paul Ponthieux in a few seconds. Hey, welcome back to Stan Energy Man here. Stan Osserman with Paul Ponthieux coming to you live and direct from North Kona on the Big Island. And we've been talking a little bit about hydrogen and also battery technology and why it's important to really understand battery technology and not just assume that all lithium batteries are created equal. And that batteries have a place even in a hydrogen system, whether it's a car or a microgrid or a big grid. Batteries have a place, and so does hydrogen. And one thing we didn't point out is on the transportation side, and being an old Air Force guy, when it comes to aviation, when you're designing airplanes and stuff, it's all about weight. The less weight you carry, the more range you can get or the more payload you can carry in your airplane. And so imagine if you had an airplane full of batteries, they'd be so heavy you could probably not even get off the ground. And if you could, you couldn't carry much. But if you could use hydrogen as the fuel or the hydrogen in fuel cells to make electricity for electric motors to propel the airplane, they could probably get you a whole lot farther because there's not hardly any weight. Hydrogen is 14 times lighter than air. But we're going to spend the rest of the time in the show talking about things that are going on around the world because this COVID-19 pandemic has certainly made huge impacts around the world in different ways on different continents and different places. But one thing's for certain, it certainly hasn't hurt the spreading of hydrogen technology in a lot of different sectors. So, Paul, what are some of the things that you've seen lately in the news?
Yeah, one of the most interesting things that I've recently come across, and it's not exactly new or unique, but it's very rare. Um, they're actually drilling for hydrogen right now. And it turns out that there's deposits of naturally occurring hydrogen in the Earth's crust. And they can drill for it just like they drill for natural gas or for oil. Um, I guess the trick is locating it and know where those deposits would be. But according to the company that I'm talking about, they're called Natural Hydrogen Energy, LLC. And they just did their first test well. And apparently, according to them, it's more abundant than anyone ever thought. So they think it's actually sustainable and so abundant that we would never run out because
Wow.
it's a continual process that's taking place in the earth. We know methane deposits are very common, but then you have to clean up the methane. But what they're talking about is actually pure hydrogen being in deposits in the ground. So I'm looking forward to finding out more about that and seeing where that goes. But that would be a real game changer because the oil industry could use their same infrastructure and same equipment and pipelines to be transporting a clean burning fuel instead of natural gas and oil.
I also heard that helium is actually getting really hard to find. Um, and like they use it in a lot of industrial purposes and certain kinds of welding, as I understand it. But it's getting so rare that it's getting really expensive. And it's interesting that hydrogen can do a lot of the same things. It's
Yeah.
actually more buoyant than helium. So that's why it was used in the early Zeppelins instead of helium because it gave the Zeppelin more lift. But we're starting to find that some of those industries are going back to using hydrogen instead of helium just because of the cost.
Yeah, interestingly enough, this company claims where they find the hydrogen, they're also finding large deposits of helium as well. So
Uh,
that's two really good income streams coming from the same well. So it's pretty interesting.
well, there's certainly a lot going on in Europe with hydrogen buses, hydrogen trains,
Yeah.
and North Sea wind to make hydrogen and putting it in gas pipelines on the continent. And then also in Asia, between Japan, South Korea, and China, things are going gangbusters on the hydrogen front. And it's almost alarming that there's so much going on in Europe and Asia, and the United States just seems to kind of be stagnating on oil and natural gas because they're cheap right now. But we're starting to see that maybe they won't be cheap for long. And I've seen a couple of financial reports saying, that the big boom of American energy may be coming up to an end here because fracking and things like that are not going to be producing as long as we thought they would. So Are you seeing the same stuff?
Yeah, what we're seeing right now is the same thing that happened with battery technologies. Once the industry recognized that renewable energy doesn't really work effectively, and we're talking about the most common ones like wind and solar, without battery storage, they're basically just additive energy sources. But with storage, they can become basically a baseload type of technology. So once that was recognized and embraced by the energy industry, the money started flowing into R&D, and battery technology took off, and it's still going strong. It's a full-time job just keeping up with the technology changes. Well, the same thing is happening with hydrogen, mostly because of our Asian and European counterparts in the hydrogen industry. With all the activity there, more and more R&D is being pumped into development, and we're seeing lots of new technologies emerge. The drilling technology one, but also on the side of electrolysis, there are new membranes being developed that are cost effective and even more efficient than the conventional use. Um, there's just more and more things coming out every week, it seems, that's showing that hydrogen is here to stay, and it's not going away, and it's going to get better and better. So we need to.
I think a lot of people were expecting, but 13 years ago, 12 years ago, 2008, when President Obama took over, that he was very environmentally savvy, and he put Dr. Chu in as his head of Department of Energy. And Dr. Chu is a well-respected PhD on the energy side, and people were expecting great things. And one of the first things he did was basically said, hydrogen's not going to hack it. And there were a lot of things going on in hydrogen back in 2000 to 2008, and they came to a screeching halt when Dr. Chu took over. You were kind of knee deep in hydrogen at that point. So what did you see?
Yeah, we were, and we were really disappointed in Chu. He cut all the funding, uh, even against the advice of most of the Senate, from all the programs that Bush had put in place. Obama came in and basically dismantled all those programs. Chu cut the funding completely, and he put all the money towards fracking and natural gas and oil drilling. Obama opened up more drilling, and we had the whole BP mess down in Louisiana, where I'm from. So it was disappointing. So we lost, almost 8 years of forward development in the hydrogen sector, and now we're playing catch up to the rest of the world. So it's interesting you brought it up, because the movie that we mentioned earlier, At War with the Dinosaurs, lays this out very, very clearly for people to understand. And it's time for people to really know the truth about what happens in politics when it comes to energy. And we could have been way ahead of the game by now if we hadn't had that setback. But that being done, it's looking up right now. There's more activity happening around the world, as we've been talking about. So I think it's going to be a short time before we actually catch up to the rest of the world, and we'll get there. I mean, we have to do it, and it's happening. Just look at Tesla, at Nikola Motors, right? What happened with Nikola recently? They did initial IPO. They were valued at $3 billion. Next day, they were at $12 billion. So it shows how much interest from investors they have in the hydrogen industry. So that's a pretty powerful statement for a company.
Yeah, silly me. I had Trevor Milton on the show twice, and now I can't even get a phone call into his office and talk to him. And it was so funny because, I kept saying, well, as soon as he goes public, I'm going to buy that stock because I'm going to be a millionaire. And then it went public, and I wasn't paying attention. And a week later, the stock was worth 3 times as much as it was when it initially started. So I'm afraid to buy it now because it went up 300%. But I did buy my plug power. I've been telling people to buy plug power for a long time, and I finally bought some myself. But things are taking off, and I put my money where my mouth is on this stuff. And we could be inside traders if we're held accountable by the, what is it, Federal Trade Commission or whatever, except I'm not rich enough and I don't think you are to make those kind of investments where it would make a big difference.
Right.
But trust me, if you're out there looking for good investments right now, start looking at some hydrogen companies because they're certainly making a difference.
That's the good news, because we know that private industry is going to do things faster than the government can do. So even though under Obama we lost some traction, private industry and investors are picking up the slack now.
Yeah, and I actually feel more comfortable with private industry doing it because when businessmen do things, it's all based on return on investment and it's all data and it's hard facts. It's not speculation. It's not,
Yeah.
they're not risk averse. But they're very good at risk management and risk analysis. And so people are starting to see that the price of hydrogen to produce hydrogen is coming down, especially as the cost of energy comes down with more and more inexpensive solar and wind. You can make the hydrogen cheaper. And as you mentioned, the technology for making electrolyzers and scaling up production is bringing down the cost of producing hydrogen and the capital costs you need to make those pieces of equipment. And it's all starting to come together. So I'm really bullish on hydrogen and what it's going to mean for our future transportation and grid wise. And I think we're tracking the right direction. Yeah, I'm going to leave the last couple of seconds for you, and then we're going to call it a wrap. But why don't you give us the last word, Paul?
Well, the last word, I think everyone out there who has any interest in hydrogen or has any interest in energy in general and our energy independence and sustainability, go on iTunes or Vimeo or Amazon Prime and rent At War with the Dinosaurs. It's a really fantastic documentary that is current, so it's not really old history. It's basically current technology and current news right now. But it does give a good outline historically of where we were and where we need to go and how we're going to get there. So I would recommend that anybody, I think you can rent it for 30 days for about $5, or you can buy it for like $13 and show it to your friends and pass it around. It's really worth watching.
Great. Well, thanks, Paul, and thanks for letting me use your facilities again and being a guest on my show. And maybe we'll have you back on in another couple of weeks because I get over here a little more often now that the quarantine's lifted traveling in our island. And it's always good to have you on the show. So thanks very much. And thanks to everyone for joining us here on ThinkTech Hawaii and Stan Energy Man, where we're trying to keep you up to speed on everything going on in hydrogen and sustainable energy. So we're doing it here in Hawaii and we're doing it in big ways. So watch us and take off from here. So until next Tuesday, aloha.
Aloha.